This gold is very sentimental to my client. It was passed down to her from loved ones. She now wants it melted down to become her engagement ring. This is the wax model of the ring I designed. This will become the engagement ring. It first needs to be sprued up, so I'll prepare the wax base. Using a hot wax pen, both the base and the ring model itself are heated up and melted together. Working my wax pen all the way around the ring, I make sure it's a secure connection. If the wax is not connected securely, it could result in a failed casting. This is the wax model of the wedding band. I'll be spruing it up right next to the engagement ring. That way I can cast both rings at one time. Now that both rings are attached, you can see two individual sprues coming out of the wax base. This is a perfect connection which will hopefully result in a perfect casting. It's now time to invest these wax models. I'm using a 3-inch flask, so the measurement of powder to water is a very specific one. I use a small scale and slowly add powder to it until I get the weight desired. I'll then add the water into the mixing bowl. I've found that it works best to add the powder to the water rather than the other way around. It just mixes better. According to the state of California, this powder is very bad for your lungs, so when I pour it into the bowl, I make sure to hold my breath at the same time. You can go the extra mile by wearing a respirator. After the powder goes in, it's a race against the clock. This investment will set pretty quickly, so I want to make sure I get it done in time. It should feel like a nice pancake batter at this point. In fact, if you make it to the end of this video, I owe you some flapjacks. The mixing bowl is then placed on an investment table and covered with a dome lid. This will make the inner chamber airtight. For what purpose, you might ask? To extract air from the investment itself. The bubbles rise from within. The chamber is then depressurized. The investment mix is then taken over to the flask, which holds our ring models, and it's poured in. After the investment fills up the flask, I bring it back over to the investment table. This eliminates air pockets in the mold and around our ring model. And it looks like I overfilled it a bit. It's sort of flowing out of the top like a slow magma. Now that that's done, the last thing I need to do is just let the flask sit for a couple of hours. That way the investment can cure fully. After the investment has fully hardened, I'll place it in the burnout oven. Think of the process like this. Those wax ring models will be melted out of the flask, thus creating a cavity for the gold to flow into. The entire burnout cycle is roughly 10 hours. These are the pieces of sentimental gold we'll be using for this cast. It's really sweet to know that gold from family members will now be added to an engagement ring. Because it is old metal, it's always good to mix in some fresh 14 karat gold alloy. This will help ensure a nice and clean casting. The hot flask is removed from the oven and dropped into the centrifuge. The crucible then slides and locks it in place. Showtime. It's time to melt down the gold and cast these rings. The direct flame rapidly heats up the gold, turning it from a solid into a liquid. The moment has arrived. The centrifuge is released, thrusting gold down into the flask. The spinning eventually slows, and it gently comes to a stop. The gold has found its new home, from the crucible down into the flask. I'll let it sit for 10 minutes before I quench it in water. After the gold cools and sets a bit, the flask is brought over this tub of water and dropped down in a process called quenching. It really is satisfying. I mean, just listen to this. The thermal shock blows out the investment, thus revealing the gold rings still in the flask. This is the time where I truly let out a sigh of relief. All of that time, all of that work led to this moment, the casting. Seeing that both rings filled completely with gold, it really makes your day. Sometimes you can get incomplete castings and you have to do the whole process over again. These castings turned out great, and it's another simple reminder why I love this trade so much. Using my fingers, I'll remove most of the investment that's been stuck onto the rings. At this point, I'll drop the rings into this magnetic tumbler. This will help brighten up the raw casting. You can see there are hundreds of tiny little magnetic pins. They tumble and spin around, thus polishing up the rings. After 10 minutes or so, I remove the rings out of the tumbler. You can see it did a great job at brightening up the raw casting. I then take the rings over to my bench pin, and using a jeweler saw, I'll cut through the spruce and release the button. The gold button can be used in many different ways. It can be remelted or recycled, or it can be rolled out and turned into a wedding band, which is what we plan to do here. Now that the excess gold has been removed, it's time to blend everything. One way I like to do that is by using a file. I like to do nice even strokes when I run a file over a ring, thus blending everything nice and smoothly. You'll also want to make sure you don't flatten out any sections of the band. To further clean up this ring, I'll take this sanding wheel and use it around the base of the head. This also blends everything together nicely. Now for the center stone, we're going to be using this beautiful 2-carat colorless moissanite. Moissanite is an excellent diamond alternative. It's also hard like a diamond, rated 9.25 out of 10 on the mineral scale of hardness. This brilliant stone is then dropped into the 4-prong setting. Each one of these 4 prongs has had a seat cut into it, or kind of think of it like a notch. This allows the stone to be popped down into place and to be securely held. Now that the moissanite is sitting down in the seats I cut for it, I'll take some pliers and start to tighten the stone. I do this by pulling the prongs down and over the stone itself. I'll go over each prong individually, making sure everything is nice and tight. Of course, I wouldn't want a stone to pop out at a future date. And that'll do it. Now that the stone is nice and tight and secured in place, it's time to file down the prongs. I don't want them sticking up too high off of the stone. I also like to use a cup burr, which basically rounds out and smooths the top of the prongs. You wouldn't want them catching on anything. Now for the last and crucial step, the final polish. Polishing is so important because it really brings out the shine in a ring. I like to use these soft polishing wheels. It's also important to polish all the areas that are hard to reach with a larger wheel. I like to use these small bristle brushes to do the trick. An inside polishing finger is also used to make sure the inside of the rings are nice and smooth. After the rings have been polished up, they're then dropped into the ultrasonic cleaner. This is a cleaner that basically removes all of the polishing compound. After letting the rings soak for 10 to 15 minutes, I take my tongs and I remove them from the basket. Then it's over to the steamer. Shooting at 60 psi, you really can't beat the job it does for cleaning. I always like to focus around the stone and underneath to make sure it shines beautifully. And there you have it, one custom wedding set, an engagement ring and wedding band. Cast using sentimental gold, the memory of these loved ones will surely linger on. And just look at that brilliant moissanite. There really is a good reason why this has become such a popular diamond alternative. As promised, if you made it this far, I owe you a stack of pancakes. Thanks for watching.